Hey dear friends, this is your personal English coach Divyam here, and today we're going to deal with unit number 13, The Dear Departed by Stanley Houghton. So let's begin. Let's review the characters first. We have two sisters called Mrs. Slater and Mrs. Jordan, and their husbands known as Henry Slater and Ben Jordan. Victoria Slater is a little girl of 10-year-old. Abel Merriweather is a grandfather. Now the play is written as if you are going to enact it on the stage, so all the details of where the things should be are given, and we are not going to go into much details about it. Let's begin with Mrs. Slater speaking something sharply. Victoria, do you hear? Come in, will you? Mrs. Slater closes window and puts the blind straight and returns to her work at the table. Victoria, a precocious girl often dressed in colors, enters. So she's calling her little daughter, who is supposedly playing outside, in a sharp voice, and she is really very playful. Mrs. Slater, I'm amazed at you, Victoria, I really am. How can you gallivanting about in the street when your grandfather lying dead and cold upstairs? I don't know. So she says, how can you be playing in the streets in those colorful clothes when you're already aware that your grandfather is dead upstairs? I'm really surprised with you. Be off now and change your dress before your Uncle Ben and Aunt Elizabeth come. It would never do for them to find you in colors, which means go upstairs and change your dress before your uncle and aunt comes in and sees you in those colorful clothes. They will be really shocked that you're wearing colorful clothes instead of the funeral attire, the mourning attire. Victoria, what are they coming for? They haven't been here for ages. So she, the little girl, is also surprised about the fact that the aunt and uncle were coming over after so many years. They have never been here. So she asks her mom. So Mrs. Slater replies, they're coming to talk about poor grandpa's affairs. Your father sent them a telegram as soon as we found he was dead. So grandpa's affairs means to settle the things of grandfather, which means the things that belong to grandfather. So who will have which items of grandfather? So it might be the pen, it might be the drawer, it might be the bureau, anything. So they are going to divide the stuff which belong to grandfather in between the two sisters. So they're coming over to decide that. And then a noise is heard, and Mrs. Slater is really surprised and shocked. She says, good gracious, that's never them. Mrs. Slater hurries to the door and opens it. No, thank goodness, it's only your father. So here she's a little bit scared about the fact that her aunt and uncle has arrived. So she is a little bit relaxed to find out that it's not the uncle and aunt, but her husband. And he's a little man, a stooping, heavy man, and he's wearing a tailcoat, grey trousers, a black tie, bowler hat, and he has a little paper parcel in his hand. Henry, not come yet, eh? Mrs. Slater, you can't see they haven't come, can you? Now, Victoria, be off upstairs in that quick. Put your white frock on with black sash. So she instructs her daughter to put on the white frock with black sash, which is actually the mourning attire. So Victoria goes out. Mrs. Slater to Henry, I'm not satisfied, but it's best we can do till our black's ready. And Ben and Elizabeth will never have thought about mourning yet, so we'll outshine them there. So from here we can see that the two sisters are competing each other. Mrs. Slater is telling her husband that they would not have planned for the mourning ceremony yet, so we will defeat them over there. And she is very sure that her sister wouldn't have thought about the formalities, so she is telling her husband that let's defeat them in that area. Get your boots off, Henry. Elizabeth, that's prying, she'll notice the least speck of dirt, which means if you make the house dirty, then Elizabeth is going to see that you're making the house dirty, and she's going to comment on that. So you better remove those shoes. Henry, I'm wondering if they'll come at all. When you and Elizabeth quarreled, she said she'd never set a foot in your house again. So Henry's a little doubtful about their visit because the two sisters had a huge fight, and they had vowed to each other that they'll never set a foot in the house again. Next, Mrs. Slater, She'll come fast enough after her share of what grandfather's left. You know how hard she can be when she likes. Where she gets it from, I can't tell. Mrs. Slater unwraps the parcel Henry has brought. It contains an apple pie, which she puts on the dish on the table. So, Mrs. Slater is telling her husband that I know she is very sharp, because when she comes to know that she's going to get certain stuff which belong to grandfather, she's going to come to her house at any cost by any means. So then Mrs. Slater, the parcel which he had, he puts it on the table, and it has an apple pie, and he puts that on the table. Henry, I suppose it's in the family. So Henry is acting sarcastic here and telling his wife that all the materialistic attraction is in the family. So what he means is even you have that. But then Mrs. Slater is a little offended, and she says, what do you mean by that, Henry Slater? Which means she is asking Henry to explain his remark. So Henry is telling, I was referring to your father, not you. Where are my slippers? So because he don't want to get the blame, he just passes the ball by saying that I was referring to your father. Even your father had so many materials, so many things that he always wanted. So I'm talking about your father, I'm not talking about you. Then he looks out for his slippers. Mrs. Slater in the kitchen, but you want a new pair? Those old ones are nearly worn out. So Mrs. Slater is little insisting, and she says that you should get a new pair of slippers. So why does he need a new pair of slippers? You don't seem to realize what it's costing me to bear up like I'm doing. My heart's fit to break when I see the little trifles that belong to grandfather lying around and think he'll never use them again. So she says that it is very hard for her to see that all the stuff that belonged to the grandfather are lying just like that and nobody's using them. So then, briskly means quickly. Here, you better wear these slippers of grandfather's now. It's lucky he'd got a new pair. So, before he died, the grandfather had bought a new pair of slippers. So, Mrs. Slater is asking her husband to wear those, to put them on. Henry, they'll be very small for me, my dear. Which means, they're not of my size. They're very small for me. Mrs. Slater, they'll stretch, won't they? I'm not going to have them wasted. So she says, when you put them on, with time, they'll get loose, and I'm not going to have them wasted. I'm not going to keep them as they are and throw it away. So she has finished laying the table. Henry, I've been thinking about the bureau of grandfather's that's in his bedroom. You know, I always wanted to have it after he died. Bureau is a writing desk with drawers. So again, we can see that Mrs. Slater is also materialistic because he is wanting things that belong to the grandfather. So he wanted the writing desk of the grandfather. So she is asking her husband that, can we please have that? So Henry says, you must arrange with Lisbeth when you're dividing things up, which means you must discuss it out with Lisbeth, whether she wants a writing desk or you will keep it. You should discuss that. Mrs. Slater, Lisbeth's that sharp. She'll see I'm after it and she'll drive a hard bargain over it. What it is to have a low money grubbing spirit. Which means she knows her sister, and she knows that Elizabeth is very, very sharp minded, and when she knows that I want the writing desk, she'll fight with me and take the writing desk anyway. And then she is feeling sad about the fact that her sister is a very materialistic woman, and she wants to grab everything that comes on her way. Henry, perhaps she's got her eyes on the bureau as well. So Henry is thinking if her sister Lisbeth also is thinking about the bureau, if she also wants the bureau. So Mrs. Slater replies, she's never been here since grandfather bought it. If it was only down here instead of his room, she'd never guess it wasn't our own. So she's very smart, Mrs. Slater. She says that since grandfather bought it, she never came to our house. So how will she know that the bureau belonged to the grandfather? She will never know. She will think that it is our. Henry is surprised. She says, Amelia, and then he rises. Mrs. Slater, Henry, we shouldn't bring that bureau down here. We could do it before they come. So Mrs. Slater is trying to think about tricks. She says that let's bring the bureau down in the drawing room so that when Elizabeth comes, she would think that the bureau is not grandfather's but Mrs. Slater's. Henry is a little stupefied and he says, I wouldn't care to. Mrs. Slater says, don't look so daft. Why not? She says, why can't we? Mrs. Slater, we could put that shabby old chest of drawers upstairs where the bureau is now. Elizabeth could have that and welcome. I've always wanted to get rid of it. She points to the drawers. So she says, let's put the chest of drawers upstairs where the bureau is and let's bring the bureau down. So when Elizabeth comes, she would see that the grandfather's room is having the old chest of drawers, and she would try to bargain for it. She would think that the old chest of drawers belong to the grandfather and not the bureau. Now, Henry, suppose they come when we're doing it. So Henry is also smart. He says that think about the situation where we are trying to move things here and there and they knock the door and they come and find out that we are moving things. What would happen then? Mrs. Slater, I'll fasten the front door. Get your coat off, Henry will change it. Mrs. Slater goes out to fasten the front door. Henry takes his coat off. Mrs. Slater reappears. So now they both are trying to get ready to move things here and there. Mrs. Slater, I'll run up and move the chairs out of the way. Victoria appears dressed according to her mother's instruction. So Mrs. Slater is telling that I'll do this, I'll do that. In the meantime, the little daughter appears and she says, will you fasten my frock up the back, mother? So she wants some help because she cannot do it herself. Mrs. Slater, I'm busy. Get your father to do it. Mrs. Slater hurries upstairs and Henry fastens the frock. Victoria, what have you got your coat off for, father? Henry, mother and me is going to bring grandfather's bureau down here. Victoria, after a moment's thought, are we pinching it before Aunt Elizabeth comes? Henry is shocked. No, my child, grandfather gave it to your mother before he died. So Victoria is a very smart little daughter. She knows what's going on and she says, are you trying to grab grandfather's stuff, father? So the father, Henry, is shocked and says, no. Grandfather himself had given it to Mrs. Slater. Victoria, this morning? Henry, yes. Victoria says, he was drunk this morning. Henry, hush, you mustn't ever say he was drunk. Now, Henry has fastened the frock and Mrs. Slater reappears carrying a handsome cloak under her arm. Mrs. Slater, I thought I'd fetch this down as well. She puts it on the mantelpiece. So Mrs. Slater is trying to grab more and more stuff from the grandfather's room so that Elizabeth cannot think about it and Elizabeth cannot bargain. So she's trying to grab everything from grandfather's room. Now, Victoria, that's grandpa's clock. Mrs. Slater, shut, be quiet, it's ours now. Come, Henry, lift your end. Victoria, don't breathe a word to your aunt about the clock and the bureau. So Mrs. Slater is warning Victoria that keep your mouth shut, do not say anything about the stuff that we've taken. Now they carry the chest of drawers through the doorway. Victoria to herself, I thought we'd pinched them. So she thinks that we have grabbed everything, we have hijacked his stuff. After a short pause, there is a sharp knock at the front door. Mrs. Slater from upstairs. Victoria, if that's your aunt and uncle, you're not to open the door. So if you see from the little hole and if you find out that it's your aunt and uncle, do not open the door. Victoria peeps through the window. Mother, it's them. Mrs. Slater, you're not to open the door till I come down. Knocking repeated. Let them knock away. There's a heavy bumping noise. Mind the wall, Henry. Henry and Mrs. Slater, very hot and flushed, stagger in with pretty old-fashioned bureau containing a log desk. They put it where the chest of drawer was and straighten the ornaments, etc. The knocking is repeated. Now, so they both come down with the bureau of the grandfather and put the old chest of drawers upstairs. So now their plan is, let Lisbeth think that the bureau belonged to Mrs. Slater, so she'll never bargain about it. Mrs. Slater, that was near a thing. Open the door, Victoria. Now, Henry, get your coat on. So now they had undressed, they had removed their clothes so that they could bring in the stuff and they could be flexible. But now, as Elizabeth and her husband have come, they need to get dressed nicely again. So she's asking her husband to put the coat on. Henry, did we knock much plaster off the wall? Mrs. Slater, never mind the plaster. Do I look all right? Which means, while moving the stuff, did the stuff hit the wall so hard that the plaster came out? I mean, did we move it very hard? And Mrs. Slater is asking Henry if she looked okay, straightening her hair as a glass. Just watch Lisbeth's face when she sees we're all in half mourning. Throws in tidbits. Take this and sit down. So she's asking Henry to pretend as if everything was okay, and she hands over a magazine called Tidbits to him and asks him to sit down to make it look like everything's normal. Now, next is, she says, take this and sit down. Try and look as if we'd been waiting for them. So he sits down in the armchair and Mrs. Slater is standing left of the table. So this is again a scene described of what it should be on the stage if you're acting, if you're trying to enact this on the stage in your occasions like annual day and stuff. So I need to describe this because it also tells about the attire. So Victoria ushers in Ben and Mrs. Jordan. The latter is stout, complacent woman with impassive and irritating air of being always right. So the sister, Lisbeth, is a little proudy woman. She thinks she's always right. And Ben is also in complete new mourning with black gloves and band around his hat. He's a rather little jolly man, accustomed to be humorous, but at present trying to adapt himself to the regrettable occasion. So this guy, Ben, is a jolly kind of a guy. He is not really serious, but he's trying to adapt himself to the situation of death. He has a bright, chirpy little voice. Ben snails into the room and solemnly goes straight to Mrs. Slater and kisses her. The men shake hands. Not a word is spoken. Mrs. Slater furtively inspects the new mourning. So now there's a little formality going on of greeting and stuff, and they inspect each other's mourning and they don't speak anything initially. So Mrs. Jordan says, well, Amelia, he's gone at last. Mrs. Slater, yes, he's gone. He was 72 a fortnight last Sunday. She sniffs back a tear. She's trying to pretend as if she's crying. Mrs. Jordan sits on the left of the table, Mrs. Slater on the right, Henry in the armchair, Ben on the sofa with the Victoria near him. So this again describes what it should be on the stage. Ben, chirpily, now Amelia, you mustn't give away. We've all got to die sometime or the other. It might have been worse. Mrs. Slater, I don't see it how. Ben, it might have been one of us. Henry, it's taken you a long time to get there, Elizabeth. Mrs. Jordan, oh, I couldn't do it. I really couldn't do it. Mrs. Slater, suspiciously, couldn't do what? Mrs. Jordan, I couldn't start without getting the mourning. Glancing her sister. Mrs. Slater, we've ordered ours, you may be sure. Acidly, I never could fancy buying ready-made things. So now, because initially they thought that, they would never be ready with the mourning, but they actually are. So Mrs. Slater is not happy about it. And so she said, I can never buy ready-made things like you did. Mrs. Jordan, no, for myself, it's such a relief to get into black. And now perhaps you'll tell us about it. What did the doctor say? So Mrs. Jordan is thinking that while the grandfather was dying, they means Mrs. Slater and her husband, they called the doctor, and it was of the doctor's opinion that the grandfather is dead. Mrs. Slater says, oh, he's not been near yet. So the doctor never came. The doctor never arrived. Mrs. Jordan, not been near? She's a little shocked here. Ben in the same breath. Didn't you send for him at once? Which means when you knew about grandfather's death, when you knew that he was dying, didn't you really call the doctor? Mrs. Slater. Of course I did. Did you take me for a fool? I sent Henry at once for Dr. Pringle, but he was out. So she says, don't consider me stupid. I called the doctor and I sent Henry. I told Henry to bring a doctor immediately, but he was not there. Ben, you should have gone for another. Lisa. Mrs. Jordan. Oh yes, it's a fatal mistake. Mrs. Slater. Pringle attended him when he was alive, and Pringle shall attend him when he's dead. That's a professional etiquette. Which means the doctor always used to do his routine checkups, and he's supposed to do all the routine checkups even when we know that he's dying. Ben. Well, you know your own business best, but Mrs. Jordan. Yes, it's a fatal mistake. Mrs. Slater. Don't talk so silly, Elizabeth. We could go to a doctor. What good could a doctor have done? Which means, even if the doctor came, what would he do? He was almost dead. Mrs. Jordan. Look at the many cases of a person being restored to life hours after they were thought to be gone. Which means, there are cases of people coming back to life hours after they were dead. There are so many cases. So here in the scene, they are trying to fight. They are trying to argue for the fact that no doctor was called. Henry, that's when they have been drowned. Your father wasn't drowned, Elizabeth. So Henry says that happens to only people who were drowned. So when they're drowned, they're taken back to the floor and they come back to life. So people who drown and restored to life, it happens to people who drown, but not anyone else. So he says the grandfather didn't drown, Elizabeth. Ben, humorously. There wasn't much fear of that. If there was one thing he couldn't bear, it was water. He laughs, but no one does. So we know that Ben has a humorous nature and tries to crack a joke here. And he says that we shouldn't be scared about it because a grandfather couldn't bear water. So how can he get drowned? And if he cannot get drowned, how can he get back to life? So he cracks a little joke, but he forgets that the atmosphere is a little serious here. Mrs. Jordan is pained. Ben is crushed at once. So Mrs. Jordan tries to shut Ben right there. Mrs. Slater. I'm sure he was a regular enough. Mrs. Jordan. If he did take a drop too much at times, we'll not dwell on that now. Mrs. Slater. Father had a merry morning. Father had been merry this morning. He was happy. He went out soon after breakfast to pay his insurance. So now they're trying to see where he was. Now they're trying to think where he was and trying to recall events. So he says he was happy this morning and he went to pay his insurance after eating something. Ben, my word, it's a good thing he did. Mrs. Jordan. He was always thoughtful in that way. He was too honorable to have gone without paying its premium. So Mrs. Jordan is trying to respect him by saying that he paid his premium, he paid his installment. So he was a good man and he was very alert when it came to paying off premiums. Mrs. Slater. Well, he must have gone around to the Ring of Bells, for he came as merry as a sandboy. So as merry as a sandboy is extremely happy, and Ring of Bells is a club which the grandfather used to visit. So Mrs. Slater says he must have gone to the club afterwards, for he was very happy when he came. So then he says, I says, we're only waiting for Henry to start dinner. Dinner, he says, I don't want no dinner. I'm going to bed. So Mrs. Slater is trying to recall the events. So she called him for dinner, to which he replied that I don't want any dinner, I'm just going to bed. So Ben is shaking his head and says, dear. So he's not happy about the fact that he didn't have dinner. Henry. And when I came, I found him undressed, sure enough, and snug his bed. He rises and stands on hearthrug. So Henry says that when I came, I found that he had removed his clothes and he directly went to the bed. Mrs. Jordan. Definitely. Yes. He'd had warning. I'm sure of that. Did he know you? Henry. Yes. He spoke to me. Mrs. Jordan. Did he say he had a warning? Henry. No. He had. He said, Henry, would you mind taking my boots off? I forgot before I got into bed. Mrs. Jordan, he must have been wandering. Henry, no, he'd got him on all right. Mrs. Slater, and when we'd finished dinner, I thought I'd take up a bit of something on a tray. He was lying there for all the world as if he was asleep, so I put the tray down on the bureau, correcting herself, on the chest of drawers, and went to waken him. He was quite cold. So they're trying to recall the events that happened when the grandfather died. So Mrs. Slater is telling everyone that when they had finished dinner, she thought she would take something on the tray for him to eat because he had not eaten anything, and he was just lying there. So he was just lying there as if he was asleep. So what Mrs. Slater did is she put the tray on the chest of drawers. Now the chest of drawers was not there. So she corrected herself and she said, so let's roll back a little bit. Mrs. Slater, she says, well, he must have gone to the club and he came very happy. I says, we're only waiting for Henry to start the dinner. Dinner, he says, I don't want no dinner, I'm going to bed. So grandfather refused to have dinner and he went to the bed just like that, at empty stomach, with an empty stomach. So Ben said, shaking his head, ah, dear Henry. And when I came, I found him undressed, sure enough, and snug in bed, which means that he, grandfather, directly went into the bed without any clothes. He rises and stands on the hearthrug. Mrs. Jordan, definitely. She says that. So Mrs. Jordan, pained. Ben is crushed at once. Mrs. Slater, I'm sure he washed regular enough. Mrs. Jordan says, if he did not take a drop too much at times, we'll not dwell on that now. Mrs. Slater, father had been married this morning. He went out soon after breakfast to pay his insurance. So Mrs. Slater is trying to recall the events that her father did before dying. So he says he was very happy this morning and he paid his premiums after having his breakfast. Ben says, my word, it's a good thing he did. Mrs. Jordan, he always was thoughtful in that way. He was too honorable to have gone without paying his premium. So now they're trying to praise him because he had paid his premium very well. Mrs. Slater, well, he must have gone round to the ring of bells afterwards, for he came in as merry as a sandboy. I says, we're only waiting for Henry to start a dinner. Dinner, he says, I don't want no dinner, I'm going to bed. So Mrs. Slater says that he must have gone to the club and he was very happy when he came. So then she asked the grandfather for dinner, but he refused and he says, I'll go to bed just like that. Ben shook his head and he was sad about it. He says, ah, dear Henry. And when I came, I found him undressed, sure enough, and snug in bed. Which means when I came from outside, I saw that he was not really wearing anything, but he was right inside the bed. He rises and stands on the hearthrug. Mrs. Jordan, definitely. Yes, he had a warning. I'm sure of that. Did he know you? Henry, yes, he spoke to me. Mrs. Jordan, did he say he had a warning? Henry, no, he said, Henry, would you mind taking my boots off? I forgot before I got into bed. Which means now Mrs. Jordan is trying to dig out the facts. So she says, did the grandfather tell you that he was going to die, that there was something uncomfortable going on in his body? So Henry replies, no, there was nothing uncomfortable. He just asked me to remove his boots. I forgot before I got into bed, which means the grandfather had forgotten to remove his boots before he was going to bed. Mrs. Jordan, he must have been wandering, he must have been lost, that's why he forgot to remove his boots. Henry, no, he'd got him on all night. So he was wearing his boots all night long on his bed. Mrs. Slater, and when we finished dinner, I thought I'd take up a bit of something on the tray. He was lying there for all the world as if he was asleep. So I put the tray down the bureau. So she mistakenly said bureau on the chest of drawers and went to wake him up. Of course, he was quite cold. So now we know that the bureau is not there. Bureau and chest of drawers are exchanged. So Mrs. Slater have to be very careful when she says bureau, because bureau isn't there. It's only the chest of drawers. Now Henry says, I heard Amelia calling for me. I ran upstairs. Mrs. Slater, of course, we could do nothing. Mrs. Jordan, he was gone? Henry, there wasn't any doubt. So they're trying to make this thing up. Now nobody actually knows how he was dead, but they are trying to pretend as if they did everything they could. So Henry says that he heard his wife calling him, so he ran upstairs. And Mrs. Slater says that she could do nothing. She agrees to the husband. She says, I went there and we saw that the grandfather was dead and we could do nothing. So Mrs. Jordan says, he was gone? She's inquisitive. She's asking if he was really dead by that time. So Henry says, there wasn't any doubt. So he was definitely dead. Mrs. Jordan, I always knew he'd go sudden in the end. A pause. They wipe their eyes and sniff back tears. So they're pretending. Everybody's pretending. We know that everybody's gathered to take away grandfather's stuff. Nobody's actually crying there. These are all crocodile tears. So Mr. Jordan says, I was very sure that he would go just like that without any disease all of a sudden. Mrs. Slater, rising briskly at length, in a business-like tone. Well, will you go up and look at him now, or shall we have a tea? So, Mrs. Jordan, what do you say, Ben? Ben, I'm not particular. Mrs. Jordan, serving the table. Well, then if the kettle's ready, we may as well have tea first. So instead of going to check the grandfather, they are having the tea. So by this itself, we can know that everybody is materialistic. Mrs. Slater puts the kettle on the fire and gets tea ready. Henry, one thing we may as well decide now, the announcement in the papers. Mrs. Jordan, I was thinking of that. What would you put? So we know that when somebody dies, there has to be some announcement. Respected so-and-so died of maybe cancer or something. We will miss him. You will be remembered for ages. So that's kind of an announcement. So they're thinking of what lines they should put. Mrs. Slater, at the residence of his daughter, 235 Upper Cornbank Street, etc., etc. Henry, you wouldn't care for a bit of a poetry. So Henry says, don't you want to put something like, you will be remembered forever, we will miss you, some poetry kind of stuff. Mrs. Jordan, I like never forgotten. It's refined. Henry, yes, but it's rather soon for that. Ben, you couldn't very well have forgot him the day after. So Ben says, how can you write never forgotten? You are just giving the announcement on the very next day in the newspaper and you are asking me to write never forgotten. Obviously you would never forget the grandfather just the day after his death. Mrs. Slater, I always fancy a loving husband, a kind father and a faithful friend. Ben, doubtfully, do you think that's right? Henry says, I don't think it's a matter of whether it's right or not. Mrs. Jordan, no, it's more for the look of the thing. So everybody's trying to think about some taglines which they could put in a newspaper which would actually justify the death. Henry, I saw a verse in Evening News yesterday. Proper poetry it was. It rhymed. He gets the paper and reads, despised and forgotten by some you may be, but the spot that contains you is sacred to we. Mrs. Jordan, that'll never do. You don't say sacred to we. Henry, it's in the paper. Mrs. Slater, you wouldn't say if you were speaking properly, but it's different in the poetry. Henry, poetic license, Mrs. Jordan, no, that'll never do. We want a verse that say how much we loved him and refers to all his good qualities and says what a heavy loss we had. So they're trying to again think about some taglines which tell everyone that the sisters and the husbands, they loved him and it's a huge loss because he died. So they want this to be there in the newspaper. Mrs. Slater, you want a whole poem? That'll cost a good lot. So you know that if you put a line in the newspaper, depending on the space and depending on the quantity, the newspaper would charge the people. So Mrs. Slater says that will cost a lot if you write a poetry. Mrs. Jordan says, well, think about it after tea, and then we'll look through his bits of things and make a list of them. There's all the furniture in his room. Henry, there's no jewelry or valuable of that sort. Mrs. Jordan, except his gold watch. He promised that to our Jimmy. Mrs. Slater, promise to your Jimmy? I never heard of that. So we know that Mrs. Slater is really materialistic. She wants all the stuff. So Mrs. Jordan, she very smartly says that he had a golden watch, but he promised that he would give it to Jimmy. So there's no Jimmy actually, but she just made it up. Mrs. Slater says, I never heard of any Jimmy. You're lying. Mrs. Jordan, oh, but he did, Amelia. When he was living with us, he was very fond of Jimmy. So Mrs. Slater, well, amazed, I don't know. So actually, Mrs. Jordan and Mrs. Slater, both of them are too materialistic, and to get that watch, Mrs. Jordan made up someone called Jimmy. Ben, anyhow, there's insurance money. Have you got a receipt for the premium he paid this morning? Mrs. Slater, I've not seen it. Victoria jumps from the sofa and comes behind the table. Victoria, Mother, I don't think grandfather went to pay his insurance this morning. But this little daughter is really smart. She knows that grandfather never went to pay his insurance. Mrs. Slater, he went out. Victoria, yes, but he didn't go into the town. He met Mr. Tattersall down the street and they went off past St. Philip's Church. Mrs. Slater, the Ringo bells, I'll be bound. Ben, the Ringo bells? Mrs. Slater, that public house that John Shark's widow keeps. He's always hanging about there. Oh, if he hasn't paid it. Ben, do you think he hasn't paid it? Was it overdue? So now they are trying to talk about the installments that the grandfather must have paid in the past. So everybody's arguing whether he paid it or not. And then there's a little girl called Victoria who comes out from nowhere, and she's very smart. She observed the grandfather going with somebody to the club. So she says the grandfather didn't go to the insurance company. He went to the club. Mrs. Slater, I should think it was overdue. Overdue means the date had already passed, and he had to pay his penalty along with the premium. Mr. Jordan, something tells me he's not paid it. I have a warning. I know it. He's not paid it. So Mrs. Jordan is certain that the grandfather did not pay his premium. Ben, the drunken old beggar. Mrs. Jordan, he's done it on purpose just to annoy us. So see, because of money, they're abusing him. Mrs. Slater, after all I've done for him, having to put up with him in the house these 3 years, it's nothing short for swindling. So Mrs. Jordan says that he just didn't pay the premium because he wanted to harass us. Mrs. Slater, after all that I've done for him. So Mrs. Slater is the one who kept the grandfather. So she says, after all that I've done for him for 3 long years, the annoyance that you are referring to is nothing at all. Mrs. Jordan, I had to put up with him for 5 years. Mrs. Slater, and you were trying to turn him over to us all the time. So now they are trying to fight over who will keep the grandfather. So Mrs. Jordan says, I lived with him for 5 years. Mrs. Slater says, I lived with him for 3 years. And Mrs. Slater also tells Mrs. Jordan that you were always trying to push him to our house all the time. Henry, but we don't know for certain that he's not paid the premium. So Henry interrupts and says, why are you fighting? We don't even know if he has paid the premium or not. Mrs. Jordan, I do. It's come over to me all at once that he hasn't. So she's very certain that he hasn't paid the premium. Mrs. Slater, Victoria, run upstairs and fetch the bunch of keys that's on your grandpa's dressing table. Victoria timidly, in grandpa's room? Mrs. Slater, yes. Victoria, I don't like to. Mrs. Slater, don't talk so silly. No one can hurt you. There's no one who can hurt you. Victoria goes out reluctantly. We'll see if he's locked the receipt up in the bureau. Ben, in where? In this thing? He rises and examines it. Mrs. Jordan also rising. Where did you pick that up, Amelia? It's new since last I was here. They examine it closely. So now they are trying to see the bureau which was there now in the drawing room and not in grandfather's room. And Mrs. Jordan is trying to examine. She is trying to think, where did this come from in the house? This is something new and I want this. Mrs. Slater, oh, Henry picked it up one day. So now they're trying to talk about where the bureau came from. Mrs. Jordan, I like it. It's artistic. Did you buy it at an auction? Henry, where did I buy it, Amelia? Mrs. Slater, yes, at an auction. So they're trying to pretend as if it was theirs. It was not the grandfather's. Ben, despairingly, oh, a second hand. So Ben is trying to pass a remark to tell them that you didn't buy a new one, so you're not rich. You bought it at a second hand, so that's fine. Mrs. Jordan, don't show your ignorance, Ben. All artistic things are second hand. Look at those old masters. Victoria returns very scared. She closes the door after her. Victoria, Mother, Mother. Mrs. Slater, what is it, child? Victoria, Grandpa's getting up. Ben, what? Mrs. Slater, what did you say? Victoria, Grandpa's getting up. Mrs. Jordan, the child's crazy. Mrs. Slater, don't talk so silly. Don't you know Grandpa's dead? Victoria, no, he's getting up. I saw him. They are transfixed with amazement. Ben and Mrs. Jordan left off the table. Victoria clings to Mrs. Slater right off the table. Henry near the fireplace. Mrs. Jordan, you'd better go up and see for yourself, Amelia. So he insists his wife to check and see if he's really up. Mrs. Slater, here, come with me, Henry. Henry draws back terrified. So everybody is shocked. How can this happen? How can the person whom we thought was dead come back to life? Ben, suddenly, listen. So now there's a little stanza which tells you that they look at the door and it's like chuckling is heard. Door opens, revealing the old man clad in faded but gay dressing gown. He is in his stockinged feet, although over 70, is vigorous and well colored. His bright malicious eyes twinkle under his heavy reddish eyebrows. He is obviously either grandfather Abel Merriweather or else his ghost. So Abel, now the grandfather, is up from the bed. He is all right. He says, what's the matter with little Vicky? What's the matter with the little girl? He sees Ben and Mr. Jordan. Hello, what brings you here? How's yourself, Ben? So grandfather is also surprised that how can Ben and Mrs. Jordan be in the house where they never were from years and years and years. So she is a little surprised. Abel thrusts his hand at Ben, who skips back smartly and retreats to safe distance below the sofa. Mrs. Slater, approaching Abel gingerly. Grandfather, is that you? She pokes him with her hand to see if it's solid. So everybody thinks that it's a grandfather's ghost and it's not real, so everybody's scared. Abel, irritated by the whispering. Of course it's me. Don't do that, Amelia. What the devil do you mean by this tomfoolery? Mrs. Slater, to the others. He's not dead. Ben, doesn't seem like it. Abel, you've kept away long enough, Lizzie, and now you come. You don't seem overpleased to me. So Abel is telling his daughter that you were far from me from a long time and you are not happy to see me now. I feel that you're not happy to see me now, Mrs. Jordan. You took us by surprise, father. Are you keeping quite well? Abel, trying to catch words. What? Mrs. Jordan, are you quite well? Abel, hey, I'm right enough for a bit of a headache. I wouldn't mind betting that I'm not the first in the house to be carried to the cemetery. I always think Henry there looks none too healthy. So he's trying to joke here and he says, I'm okay, I just have a little headache. I think Henry doesn't look fine to me. Mrs. Jordan, well, I never. Abel crosses the armchair. Henry gets out of his way to the front table. So now the grandfather is moving around in the house. Abel, Amelia, what the dickens did I do with my new slippers? Mrs. Slater is confused. Aren't they by the hurt, grandfather? So now, because we know that Henry took away the slippers. And Mrs. Slater had insisted Henry to take away grandfather's slippers, so now they're gone. And grandfather, as he's up, he's trying to find the slippers. Abel, I don't see them. Observing Henry trying to remove the slippers. Why, you've got him on, Henry? Mrs. Slater promptly. I told him to put them onto to stress them. They were that new hard. Now Henry, Mrs. Slater snatches the slipper from Henry and gives it to Abel, who puts them on and sits in the armchair. So she snatches the slipper from Henry by giving the excuse that I wanted those slippers to be a little stretched, and so I asked Henry to put them on. Mrs. Jordan to Ben. Well, I don't call that delicate, stepping into dead man's shoe in such haste. So now Jordan is also aware that Mrs. Jordan is also aware that Mrs. Slater is little materialistic, so she says, it's not good to snatch away things. Henry goes up to the window and pulls up the blind. Victoria runs across to Abel and sits on the floor at his feet. Victoria, oh Grandpa, I'm so glad you're not dead. So Victoria is a little girl who's innocent, and she addresses her grandfather and says that she was happy that he was not dead. Mrs. Slater, in vindictive whispering, hold your tongue, Victoria, which means shut up. Abel, what's that? Who's gone dead? Mrs. Slater, loudly. Victoria says, she's sorry about your head. So they're a little stammering here, and Mrs. Slater is shouting loudly, and she's trying to make an excuse about the little daughter's speech. She says that she's sorry about your head and not dead. Abel, thank you, Vicky, but I'm feeling better. Mrs. Slater to Mrs. Jordan, he's so fond of Victoria. Mrs. Jordan to Mrs. Slater, yes, he's fond of our Jimmy too. Mrs. Slater, you'd better ask him if he promised your Jimmy his gold watch. Mrs. Jordan, disconcerted, I couldn't just now. I don't feel equal to it. So now there is a plot twist. Why? Because Mrs. Jordan said that Jimmy is gonna take grandfather's golden watch, and she was not really sure about it. Mrs. Slater was not sure about it. So now that grandfather was up and running, she asks Mrs. Jordan to confirm with grandfather if Jimmy was the one who can own his golden watch. So Mrs. Jordan cannot, because everybody knows she's lying. So she says, I cannot now. I don't feel equal to it. Abel, why Ben, you're in the morning. And Leslie too. And Maria and Henry and little Vicky. Who's gone dead? It's someone in the family? He chuckles. So Abel says, why are you dressed up like this? Where are you going? In whose morning are you going? Mrs. Slater, no one you know, father, a relation of Ben's. Abel, and what relation of Ben's? His brother. So Mrs. Slater is trying to make things up. She's trying to make excuses that they are going to his brother's funeral, his brother's mourning. So Ben to Mrs. Slater, hang it, I never had one. Abel, dear. And what was his name, Ben? Ben at a loss. He crossed to the front of the table. Mrs. Slater, right of the table, prompting. Frederick. Mrs. Jordan, left of the table, prompting. Albert. Ben. Isaac. Abel. Isaac? So everybody's trying to throw names because there is no real brother. So Abel, Isaac. And where did your brother Isaac die? In Australia. Abel, dear. He'd be older than you, eh? Ben, yes, 5 years. Abel, are you going to the funeral? Ben, oh yes, Mrs. Slater and Mrs. Jordan. No, of course not. He returns to the left. Abel rising. Well, I suppose you've only been waiting for me to begin tea. I'm feeling hungry. So here they made up an excuse that somebody else had died and not the grandfather. And Abel Mayweather is coming forward to have tea, and he says, because the tea is lying there, I'm very sure that you were waiting for me. Mrs. Slater, take him the kettle. I'll make the tea. Abel, come along now. Sit you down and let's be jolly. So he's very happy now. Abel sits at the head of the table facing spectators. Ben and Miss Jordan on the left. Victoria brings a chair and sits by Abel. Mrs. Slater and Henry sit on the right. Both women are next to Abel. So this is the situation that you should mimic on the stage. Mrs. Slater: Henry, give Grandpa some pie. Abel: thank you, I'll make a start. He helps himself to bread and butter. Henry serves the pie and Mrs. Slater pours out the tea. Only Abel eats with any heartiness. Ben: glad to see you've got an appetite, Mr. Merriweather, although you've not been so well. Abel: nothing serious, I've been lying down for a bit. Mrs. Slater: been to sleep, father? Abel: no, I've not been to sleep. Mrs. Slater and Henry: oh. Abel: eating and drinking. I can't exactly call everything to my mind, but I remember I was a bit dazed, like I couldn't move an inch, hand or a foot. So what he says is he was a little bit dazed, means when he went to sleep he couldn't move his hands and legs, and that's all he remembers. Ben: and could you see and hear Mr. Merriweather? So Ben and everybody else is a little scared. Why are they scared? They are scared because if Abel heard everything they spoke, then Abel would know that everybody is trying to get whatever the grandfather had. So he's asking this question particularly, that whether you could see and hear anything. Abel: yes, but I don't remember seeing anything in particular. Mustard, Ben? He is asking for a mustard. Mrs. Slater: of course not, grandfather. It was all your fancy. You must have been asleep. Abel snappishly: I tell you I wasn't asleep, Amelia. Damn it, I ought to know. Mrs. Jordan: didn't you see Henry or Amelia coming into the room? Abel scratching his head: now let me think. So now we also know that Amelia and Jordan never went to his room, right? So nothing happened like that. No such incident happened. So Abel is trying to think. Mrs. Slater: I wouldn't press him, Lisbeth. Don't press him. So Mrs. Slater is asking others not to make him recall things because they are all wrong. Everything was made up. Henry: I wouldn't worry him. Abel suddenly recollecting: Abe, God. Amelia and Henry: what the devil did you mean by shifting my bureau out of my bedroom? So now Abel saw the bureau which was there in the drawing room instead of his bedroom. Henry and Mrs. Slater are speechless. Do you hear me, Henry and Amelia? Mrs. Jordan: what bureau was that, father? Abel: why, my bureau, the one I bought. Mrs. Jordan pointing to the bureau: was it that one, father? So Mrs. Jordan is unaware about the bureau because when she came last time the bureau wasn't there, and when she comes this time the bureau is there, but it's in the drawing room, so she thinks that the bureau belongs to the sister. Abel: ah, that's it. What's it doing here? Huh? A pause. The clock on the mantelpiece strikes 6. Everyone looks at it. Dart me if that isn't my clock too. What the devil's been going in this house? A slight pause. So Abel is now trying to figure out something's fishy. So he saw the bureau, he saw the clock which made noise coincidentally, and now he realizes that all my stuff is here. Ben: well, I'll be hanged. Mrs. Jordan: I tell you what's been going on in this house, father. Nothing short of robbery. Mrs. Slater: be quiet, Lisbeth. Mrs. Jordan rising: I'll not be quiet. Oh, I call it double-faced. Henry: now, Lisbeth. Mrs. Jordan: and you too. Are you such a poor creature that you must do every dirty thing she tells you? Mrs. Slater rising: remember where you are, Lisbeth. Henry: come, no quarreling. Ben: my wife's every right to speak her own mind. Mrs. Slater: then she can speak it out, not here. Abel rising, thumping the table: damn it all, will someone tell me what's been going on? So now everybody's fighting here. The two sisters started quarreling again. Mrs. Jordan: yes, I will. I'll not see you robbed. Abel: who's been robbing me? Mrs. Jordan: Amelia and Henry. They have stolen your clock and your bureau. Working herself up, they sneaked into your room like a thief in the night and stole them after you were dead. Henry and Mrs. Slater: hush, quiet, Lisbeth. Mrs. Jordan: I'll not be stopped after you were dead, I say. Abel, after who was dead? Mrs. Jordan, you. Abel, but I am not dead. Mrs. Jordan, no, but they thought you were. So Mrs. Jordan is trying to open the cards, is trying to tell everything to Abel of whatever happened. So Mrs. Jordan is telling the grandfather that they thought you were dead, and then Abel gazes around them. Abel, oh ho, so that's why you're all in black today. You thought I was dead. That was a big mistake. He sits and resumes his tea. Mrs. Slater sobbing. Grandfather. Abel, I didn't take you long to start dividing my things between you. Mrs. Jordan, no father, you mustn't think that. Amelia was simply getting hold of them on her own account. So Mrs. Jordan says that I'm not at fault. She took your things on her side, so she is at fault. Abel, you always were a keen one, Amelia. So grandfather is aware about the fact that Amelia wanted grandfather's stuff. I suppose you thought the will wasn't fair. Henry, did you make a will? Did you make a will? Yes, it was locked up in the bureau. And what was in it, father? Abel. So here we see that Abel had made a will, had written it in the paper that item number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 belongs to sister number 1, and item number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 will belong to sister number 2. So he said, I had made a will like that, it was already in the bureau. So Henry said, did you make a will like that? The division of things? Abel said, yes, it was locked up in the bureau. And Mrs. Jordan says, what was that? What was that in the will? Please tell us, father, what was that? Abel says, how does it matter now? I'm going to destroy it and make another. Mrs. Slater, she's crying. Grandfather, you'll not be hard on me. Abel, I'll trouble you for another cup of tea, Amelia. 2 lumps and plenty of milk. So 1 cup of tea is done. And because of the situation which infuriated him, he asked for another cup of tea. Mrs. Slater, with pleasure, grandfather. She pours out the tea. Abel, I don't want to be hard on anyone. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Since your mother died, I've lived part of the time with you, Amelia, and part with you, Leslie. Well, I shall make a new will leaving all my bits of things to whomever I'm living with, and when I die. How does that strike you? So he says, I've lived with you, Mrs. Slater. I've lived with you, Mrs. Jordan. I've lived with both of you. And now that I see that you have stolen my stuff and you are fighting over my stuff, I had made a will in which I was going to distribute my things equally. I'm going to destroy that, and I'm going to make a brand new will. And in that will, I would have written that all my stuff will go to the person with whom I live next. So he puts a condition. Henry, that's a bit of a lottery lie. So the situation is, if the grandfather lives with sister 1, all the things belong to sister 1. If he remains with sister 2, all his stuff will go to sister 2. Mrs. Jordan, and who do you intend to live with from now? So Mrs. Jordan wants to know if she's gonna get everything. So she says, with whom are you gonna live? With me or her? Abel, drinking his tea. I'm just coming to that. So I'm going to discuss that. Hold on, sit down. Mrs. Jordan, you know, father, it's quite time you came to live with us again. It would make you very comfortable. So now the 2 sisters are fighting over who will keep the grandfather, because of the new will which states that whoever keeps the grandfather takes everything that he has after his death. So now they are fighting over it. Mrs. Slater, no, he's not been with us as long as he was with you. Mrs. Jordan, I may be wrong, but I don't think father will fancy living on with you after what's happened today. So now they're fighting over who would keep the grandfather. Abel, so you'd like to have me again, Leslie? Mrs. Jordan, you know, we're ready for you to make your home with us for as long as you please. Abel, what do you say to that, Amelia? Mrs. Slater, all I can say is Elizabeth's changed her mind in the last 2 years. She rose up and says, Grandfather, do you know what the quarrel between us was about? Mrs. Jordan, Amelia, don't be fooled, sit down. So now she discloses the reason for the quarrel that happened between the two sisters years ago and the reason why they separated. Mrs. Slater: "No. If I'm not to have him, you shall not either. We quarreled because Elizabeth said she wouldn't take you off our hands at any price. She said she had enough of you to last a lifetime, and we'd got to keep you." So the quarrel, what was the quarrel that happened a couple of years ago? It was for the fact that who will keep the grandfather. It was the same subject, and Mrs. Jordan had pushed the grandfather to Mrs. Slater's house and said that he's gonna stay with you forever, I'm not gonna keep him, and that's why the grandfather was with Mrs. Slater. Now the grandfather is speaking. "It seems to me that neither of you has any cause to feel proud about the way you have treated me." Mrs. Slater: "If I've done anything wrong, I'm sure I'm sorry for it." Mrs. Jordan: "And I can't say more than that too." Abel: "It's a bit late to say now. Neither of you cared to put up with me." So Abel says, "Don't be sorry. I don't care about your sorry. Don't apologize." And Mrs. Slater and Mrs. Jordan, they both say, no, grandfather, don't think like that. It's not late." The grandfather says, "Hey, you both say that because of what I've told you about leaving my money. Well, since you don't want me, I'll go to someone that does." Ben: "Come, Mr. Merriweather. You got to live with one of your daughters." So Ben says, "Let's be practical and logical. Who do you have in this world except your daughters? You have to live with one of them." Abel: "I'll tell you what I've got to do. On Monday next, I've got to do 3 things. I've got to go to the lawyer and alter my will. I've got to go to the insurance office to pay my premium. And I've got to go to St. Philip's Church and get married." Ben and Henry: What? Mrs. Jordan: "Get married?" Mrs. Slater: "He's out of his senses." Abel: "I say I'm going to get married." Mrs. Slater: "Who to?" Abel: "To Mrs. Shorrocks, who keeps the club. We've had it fixed up a good while now, but I was keeping it for a pleasant surprise." He rises. "I felt I was a bit of a burden to you, so I found someone who'd think it pleasure to look after me. We shall be very glad to see you at the ceremony." He gets to the door. "Till Monday then, 12 o'clock at St. Philip's Church." Opening the door. "It's a good thing that you bought the bureau downstairs, Amelia. It will be handier to carry across the ring of bells on Monday." So, big twist, big climax of the ending of the drama. Abel says that, "I know that I've got 2 daughters and I've got to choose one from them, but because both the daughters do not respect him, do not feel proud to have kept him for years, and now that he has observed that both the daughters were mean to him, he has decided something else." So he had decided that the owner of the club was a widower and he is going to get married to her and do a couple of other stuff like pay the premium, and there was one more thing: pay the premium, go to the lawyer and alter his will, and get married. So everybody is shocked. How can this happen? He says, "Yes, that's going to happen. And oh, one more thing. It's good that you brought the bureau downstairs, because whenever I wish to shift it to ring of bells, it will be easy for me." And the curtain falls. Interesting play. I hope you like it. And if you liked it, do subscribe so that I can teach you more and we can learn more. Thank you so much for watching, and have an amazing day ahead.